give me your word. You give me your word. Won't you give me your word? You give me your word. You give me your word. You give me your word. Won't you give me your word? Won't you give me your guarantee that what you say will be an eventuality? Oh no, won't you give me your word? Won't you give me a guarantee that what you say will be an eventuality? You're gonna see it'll set you free when you're no longer reliable. Yeah, what you say will be an eventuality. Oh, won't you give me your word? Won't you give me a guarantee that what you say will be an eventuality? Oh, no, no, you give me your word. It wasn't that long ago, before the first mobile, that plans were set in stone without relying on a telephone. You had to commit. She's so fine, just like a fine red wine. You know it's a crime to see her home. She's so fine, just like a fine red wine. You know it's a crime to see her home alone. Well, let me tell you all the story. I got something to say about this little slice of heaven I met the other day. See, I've been thinking all about it almost all the time. To be completely, totally honest with you, I don't mind. She's the girl next door when she knock on my door. She's my Billie Jean lover when we get on the floor. The smile is up the room just like she's Emma Stone. And her body got me thinking Marilyn Monroe. Now, I'm not gonna change a lot my long-term plan, but if I see her in the room, I'm gonna ask her to dance. Rock her back to my pistol, but all night long. It's my kind of conversation, but that's another song. Now, she's so fine, just like a fine red wine. You know it's a crime to see her home alone. She's so fine, just like a fine red wine. You know it's a crime to see her home alone. We'll do it 1 time, 2 times, 3 times, 4, 5, 6, 7 times, 8 times or more. There's only 2 types of things you can do in a bed. I ain't got time for both, so I can see when I'm dead. I might get experimental, try it in the bath. Vitamins for no form of nausea, well, I really don't know just how long this will last. But you know I couldn't let this opportunity pass. Well, if it ends, it won't be tearless, but I'll be fearless. Not saying it's not real, just not so serious. I'm really not afraid to go and dive in deep. But come on, let's get real. I've known her just 1 week now. She's so fine, just like a fine red wine. You know it's a crime to see her home alone. She's so fine, just like a fine red wine. You know it's a crime to see her home alone. Now she doesn't know just how much she can turn me on, and she lights a spark in my heart. Let me get it on when I close my eyes in the dark. She is on my mind. She's so fine, just like a fine red wine. You know it's a crime to see her home alone. She's so fine, just like a fine red wine. You know it's a crime to see her home alone. Home alone now. She It rains in a pause on a video store, keeps the lovers indoors. Lovers indoors, didn't budget for the exact contours of the musical score. The musical score opens gaping source for another encore. Some unfinished wars send her out the front door. Into the downpours raining by the seashore. Into the downpours raining by the seashore. You're spending most of your time inside a bottle of wine. Tell me why should I have to ask about all this broken glass? You didn't try to hide it. There's so much blood on the floor. What are we doing this for? You couldn't let it slide. It's getting desperate now. Can you turn the tide? The salt spray crashing into her face might have run away, but can't see in this haze. Can't see in this haze. While there's so much rain, no amount of sun rays will make a brighter day. A brighter day. Well, that was just a phase. For this relocate, there is little praise for that golden bay with its golden glaze corroded by the salt spray. With its golden glaze corroded by the salt spray. You're spending most of your time inside a bottle of wine. Tell me why should I have to ask about all this broken glass? You didn't try to hide it. There's so much blood on the floor. What are we doing this for? You couldn't let it slide. It's getting desperate now. Can you turn the tide? You're spending most of your time inside a bottle of wine. Tell me why should I have to ask about all this broken?
Hello everyone and welcome to Pint AU Online. This is the first of the Pint AU Online panel discussions, and the theme, as you just saw, is building a resilient environment. So my name is Lee Constable, and first of all I'd like to start in the way we normally would if we were running these events in pubs around Australia, and that is with an acknowledgement of country. So normally in a pint event, we would be acknowledging the traditional owners of the country on which we stand. But tonight, we're all coming to this event as speakers, but also all of you in the audience from various Indigenous nations across Australia. So I'd like to start by acknowledging all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders and elders past, present and emerging. And of course acknowledge that Indigenous people of Australia are our first innovators and scientists of this land. So I join you today from Brisbane, from the land of the Turrbal and Yagara people. My name is Lee Constable and I'm a science TV presenter, science communicator. I'm many things, I'm not quite sure which, but they all bring me to events like this where we love to share a passion for science. And we've got three amazing speakers tonight who are researchers in different fields that relate to building resilient environments. So I'll start by introducing each of our speakers, but remember throughout this evening you will be able to ask questions. So whether you're joining us on YouTube or Facebook, you'll be able to post your questions in the comments underneath the stream, and you'll also be able to ask questions on Twitter with the hashtag PintAUPanels. That's hashtag PintAUPanels. And at the end of the three speakers, I'll be looking at the questions and helping find those answers for you. So keep asking questions throughout. So we've got three speakers this evening. Our first speaker will be Jacinta Humphrey. She is a PhD candidate at La Trobe University in Melbourne. She's at the Research Centre for Future Landscapes, and she studies the impacts of urbanisation and urban development on bird communities. Our second speaker, so hi Jacinta, you can see her there. All right, so our third speaker is Melanie Pill. Melanie is a PhD student at ANU Fenner School of Environment and Society. She has a bachelor's degree in economics and a master's degree in environmental management, and she'll be talking about financing, loss and damage from climate change in small island states. So those are our three speakers. You can see them all there on screen this evening. You'll be able to ask them all questions at the end and throughout. Keep them in mind, type them out. So our first speaker I'd like to introduce is Jacinta Humphrey with Birds in the Burbs.
Thanks, Lee. Good evening, everyone. As Lee mentioned, my name is Jacinta Humphrey. I'm an urban ecologist and a current PhD student with the Research Centre for Future Landscapes, which is at La Trobe University in Melbourne. So as an urban ecologist, I study the interactions between different species habitat in an urban context. I'm particularly interested in the interactions between humans and animals that occur in and around cities. So many people will be aware that cities are incredibly important for our species and our society. Here in Australia, approximately 86% of the human population live in cities and towns. But what people are often less aware of is that cities and suburbs are also critical habitats for a range of wildlife species, including native mammals, birds, reptiles, and invertebrates. City-dwelling species are now under increasing pressure from urbanisation. As the human population grows, our cities become more intensely developed, and they tend to expand further and further out. And this poses three main challenges for wildlife. They have to face an overall loss of habitat, a decline in habitat quality, and a loss of habitat connectivity. Urban development tends to result in the clearing of vegetation, such as large old gum trees and patches of bushland, in order to make way for new houses, shops, and roads. With less available habitat, wildlife can be forced to compete for space and resources, such as food, water, and nesting sites. In addition, wildlife in urban areas experience all kinds of disturbances that they wouldn't normally encounter in their natural habitat, such as the presence of people, domestic pets, and invasive species like blackberry, rabbits, and foxes. Urban wildlife can also be exposed to a range of environmental pollutants, including litter, artificial light at night, and human-related noise. Finally, the patches of habitat that remain within our cities are often very small and isolated. This can make it difficult for animals to move around the landscape safely to disperse to new areas. Over time, this isolation can lead to poor health and low genetic diversity in animal populations. For these reasons, urbanisation is now considered a major threat to biodiversity worldwide. It's now more important than ever that we work towards more livable cities for both people and wildlife. So this is where my research comes in. My PhD focuses on the impact of urban development on birds. I'm interested in understanding how local housing density and the extent of tree cover influence the diversity, abundance, and composition of our bird communities. I aim to determine how the bird community changes when we remove habitat and build more houses. Which species can persist in heavily developed areas, and which do we lose? Ultimately, I hope to develop some recommendations on how we can maintain or promote bird diversity throughout our suburbs in order to create more successful wildlife-friendly cities. To introduce my research in a more visual way, I'm going to play a short video. I hope you enjoy it, and I look forward to your questions this evening. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Jacinta. And I just wanted to remind everyone to keep the those questions coming in for Jacinta in the comments below the stream, and also on Twitter with hashtag ScienceAUOnline. And now I pass you over to Stuart, who's going to ask, are we ready to drink recycled water? Stuart.
Thank you, Lee. So I really enjoyed that presentation from Jacinta, hearing about birds in our urban environments, in our cities. Of course, one of the things, if we want birds and we want other wildlife in our cities, we need habitat, we need vegetation, and all of the trees that we're going to need to be able to keep alive in urban parts of our cities that exist and in urban parts of our cities that are expanding. And I'm in Sydney, and we're very focused on the fact that Sydney is going to be growing by millions of people per decade, 1 million people per decade in Western Sydney. We need a livable city. We will need trees, we will need greenery, and we will need clean, safe drinking water for people to be able to achieve a livable city. So water is an essential component in the way that we plan for our cities and the way that we move forward. We've just come through a very severe drought in Australia, and we know that this was an exceptional drought. It was a very severe drought, but we know that drought is a pattern. It's a reoccurring pattern that we will endure time and time again. We need to find solutions that help us to get through those droughts. So the ways that we deliver water to our cities, we will need to think about very carefully. And at the moment, we rely heavily on things like big dams and pipes that bring water into our cities. Increasingly, we're looking at things like seawater desalination. In many cases, we will be looking at making better use of the water that we currently call wastewater. So this is the water that comes from our sewage treatment plants. We treat it to a particular level such that it's sufficient to discharge out into the environment. And in fact, a lot of that we discharge straight out into the Pacific Ocean for all our big, our coastal cities, Brisbane and Sydney certainly, and in Melbourne, down into the Bay as well. So we need to think about, are we making good use of that water, and are there opportunities there to do something better with it? There are a couple of slides, Lee, I don't know if you can bring them up, but one of the slides that I put together shows how we're already doing that. Wastewater, and we can clean it to a level that is purified and safe and reliable to put back into our drinking water supplies. And that's exactly what Perth does. Perth takes a lot of its drinking water from groundwater. So that's Perth's big storage. It's not the reservoirs, it's not the dams, it's the groundwater aquifer. So in Perth, they purify that water, they put it down into the aquifer, they pull it back out again, and it goes to their drinking water treatment plants, and it becomes part of the drinking water supply again. So it's a very clear cycle. It is recycling. In Queensland, Brisbane built a large scheme known as the Western Corridor Recycled Water Scheme. This scheme was built during the Millennium Drought, so about 2001 to 2009. And that scheme takes nearly all of the wastewater, nearly all of the sewage produced in southeast Queensland through 6 sewage treatment plants, and can collect water from those 6 treatment plants and take them to 3 advanced water treatment plants that are listed on the bottom of the slide there, where that water is ultra purified through membrane treatment processes, ultrafiltration, reverse osmosis, ultraviolet disinfection in a process that we call advanced oxidation, treated again with chlorine, and then put back into what is Brisbane's major drinking water supply, or southeast Queensland's major drinking water supply, which is Lake Wivenhoe or Wivenhoe Dam, where it becomes drinking water again. That scheme was fully constructed in 2009. However, it was not flicked on. All of the plants were operating, but the valve that releases the water into Lake Wivenhoe was never opened for various reasons, but the main one being we'd come to the end of the Millennium Drought. And by 2011, Brisbane was flooding. There was no room left in that dam. It was overflowing in a very severe way. And again in 2013, with very serious implications, loss of life and billions of dollars worth of property damage. So that scheme hasn't been operated, but it is sitting there available, and it is part of Brisbane's water supply security program. So if you have a look at the next slide, we'll see from southeast Queensland's current water supply security scheme, this upside down triangle shows the plan that's in place for the steps that will be taken as the reservoirs start to drop in Brisbane. And I've circled in red there's a trigger point at 60% when this big water recycling scheme, the Western Corridor Recycled Water Scheme, will be recommissioned and will start putting water eventually back into Lake Wivenhoe once it's ready to do that. It'll probably be a 2-year process to get that scheme up and running again. But right now, it's part of the security. The fact that it's there, the fact that we can rely on it to be switched on when it's needed, provides the water security for southeast Queensland. So they don't need to be off looking at other water supply alternatives at this time. That's a trend that we're going to see around Australia, I think particularly in inland parts of Australia, where we don't have access to seawater desalination, but there are also real drivers for the coastal cities as well in terms of energy efficiency and lower costs than seawater desalination. So I think at the moment, southeast Queensland's sitting on about 66% of capacity. So they're not far off reaching that recommissioning trigger. And when they do, we'll all be talking about recycled water as an important component of drinking water supplies in Australian towns and cities.
Thank you so much, Stuart. Lots to think about there. Do keep your questions coming in the comments and on Twitter with the hashtag #PintAUOnline. And I'll pass you over to our final speaker, Melanie Pill, who's talking about financing, loss and damage from climate change in small island states. Melanie.
Thank you so much, Lee. Thank you so much for having me tonight on the panel. Probably maybe the first one online, Pint of Science. Maybe not the last one, though. Let's see what happens. Yeah, like Lee said, my research is on financing, loss and damage from climate change. I focus on small island developing states, not because they're so pretty, they are, but also because they are really facing the issues of climate change at the moment very severely. So I thought before we can have a good discussion later and some questions, I'll give you a little bit of an idea what I mean or what we mean when we say loss and damage in the climate change context. So I promise there's not going to be a lecture here, pictures only. So yeah, thanks for the slides. One aspect of loss and damage, and that's really relevant to the Pacific and the Caribbean are natural disasters. So we're talking about hurricanes and floods. And one of those hurricanes was a Category 5 hurricane in 2017 in the Caribbean. And you can see in the picture, that is the capital of Dominica, a small island in the Caribbean. And that was when it was mostly rebuilt. And next to it, you can see a picture that was taken after the hurricane went through the houses of people. So these are actual pictures that I took or people gave me. So this is not something I took from a newspaper. And of course, you might have heard it. We just had another Category 5 hurricane in the Pacific, Hurricane Harold, which is maybe not so much on people's radar at the moment because of what's currently going on. And then we also have, and that was one thing that Jacinta touched on, we have nature and habitat loss for native animals. And that gets largely destroyed during natural disasters as well. So again, here on the right-hand side, you can see what it was after the hurricane. Most of the vegetation is gone, and that was 2 years after the hurricane struck. So it takes quite a while for it to come back, for the habitat to come back. And on the left-hand side, you see what it should be looking like without any damage. And so you can have those losses to infrastructure and houses, and they have a monetary value. But then we also have losses that are not tangible. So you can't put a dollar figure on it. You don't know how much you would be willing to pay for it. So these losses are very personal, and they have to do with your culture, with heritage, indigenous knowledge, or loss of biodiversity, or even loss of life. Just next slide, please. So these are just some of the examples, and you could probably come up with more because it differs from individual to individual. It differs from me to you, basically. I did some interviews in Dominica, so that was my field work. And I spoke to residents in Roseau, in the capital city. And one of the things that I found out is they talk about the trauma that you have after the hurricane, and things that were really important to them afterwards, or what they said they've lost were personal belongings or pictures with memories in that you can just never get back. And some of the people will even have to move in the future due to sea level rise or events that happen over a longer period of time, such as salinization, what Stuart just talked about, or soil erosion. And against what people think, a lot of people don't want to leave their homes. They want to stay where they are. They want to stay in their home country. And then we have ocean acidification, another type of loss and damage, which causes our severe bleaching of the coral reefs. And for some, it might look like if this is something that only happens in developing countries, but that's not true anymore. So here in Australia, we experience unprecedented droughts. Also, Stuart mentioned that. We had the most devastating bushfire season in history, and we have species that are brought to the brink of extinction. Yeah, so one thing, or in my research, what I look at is how we can finance all of this. So I go and interview people in international governments, in small island developing states. I talk to United Nations representatives, or I do field work in the Caribbean, where I then talk to people on the ground and were affected by these hurricanes and these losses that are on such personal levels. And I ask them what they need, what they require on the ground. And hopefully with my research, we're able to find or develop a finance mechanism together with the international community to preserve these precious resources, or find solutions for conservation, or help people just to get back on their feet and get their livelihoods back after these devastating events. Yeah, so that's from me. And I hope it wasn't too depressing. And I hope that you have a lot of questions for me or for the whole panel. So looking forward to it.
Thanks so much, Melanie. And there are already questions coming through. A reminder that if you have any questions for Melanie, for Stuart, or for Jacinta, you can type them in. If you're on Facebook or YouTube, you can type them in the comments below the live stream. And if you're on Twitter, I just want to clarify that hashtag. It is hashtag #PintAUPanels. So hashtag #PintAUPanels. And we've got people having a look at those. I've been having a look at all the questions coming through. And we'll start with Jacinta, given that you've had a few questions come through that have been similar. So I'll just highlight these first for you. There have been people asking, and I'll go through so that I can name a few of the people watching. We've got Angela Carberry via Twitter, who was asking what trees or flowering shrubs are good for encouraging birds in our backyard, and other similar questions on YouTube as well. One from Yvette and one from Jack on what Yvette says, what are good bird attracting trees or plants near your house? And Jack says, can green infrastructure like green walls and roofs be suitable for bird habitats in suburbs? So lots of questions there.
Yeah, cool. All right, thanks, Lee. I'll start with what you can actually be planting in your own private gardens. One of the best resources that I know of, at least in Melbourne, is actually getting to know your local councils. They often have information available on what plants are locally native to your area, or what plants are indigenous is the word that we would use. So they're plants that would be growing in the area where you live in your particular suburbs naturally before human development came through. And they're going to be the best options for you to be planting within your private gardens in terms of attracting birds and providing them with shelter and food resources. But ultimately, you want to make sure that you have a variety of plants so that you're not just catering to the birds that feed on nectar in flowers. You're also going to be catering to birds that might be feeding on insects or birds that are going to be feeding on seed pods and cones in some plants. You want a nice variety so that we're not just helping out one group of birds. We're trying to get the full diversity that you've got available. And then the second question was to do with green roofs in urban spaces. So they are definitely something that's kind of coming into vogue a little bit more in cities. I don't know if there's been a lot of research done so far on how they're actually going to be impacting birds, but I know that there are people researching that kind of thing for insects. So certainly if you can have some kind of green roof infrastructure that will attract insects, it's probably also going to be good for any birds that are feeding on those insects. Not a positive for the insects because they're probably going to get eaten, but if they're able to provide food resources for insectivorous birds, then that could be a positive for the birds, yes.
Circle of life. Love it. Okay, well, I might throw one out to Stuart at this time. We've got Chris on YouTube who wants to ask Stuart, do the advanced water treatment facilities remove substances like hormones, antibiotics, for example, through oxidation?
Yes, and that's a very important question. We need to know that we are producing very safe water very reliably all of the time. And the way that that's managed is, in fact, by making sure that there isn't just one process that's effective for removing each of the key contaminants that we're concerned about, but we talk about having multiple barriers. So membrane treatment processes like reverse osmosis, the very tight porosity membrane treatment process, does remove hormones and antibiotics and other small chemical contaminants. But as you suggest, also so do the advanced oxidation processes. So it's a matter of making sure that you have even you meet even more stringent requirements than what's required at the end of the pipe by making sure there are multiple processes along the way that can do the job. So the answer is very much yes. In fact, I did my PhD on the performance of advanced treatment processes to remove exactly these types of chemicals. So I can tell you that research has been going on internationally for 2 decades now, and there's a massive body of evidence to answer that question and demonstrate that the answer is yes.
Great. Well, I certainly asked the right person there, Stuart. Thanks so much. And just to keep things equal, I'll throw one out to Melanie now, because we've got some coming through for you, which is great. How expensive is climate change going to be, and what would it cost an island nation? Now, that's a huge question, Melanie. Go for it.
To be honest, I don't really know whether I can answer that. I don't know. Some people say loss and damage goes into the trillions of dollars. So, and that's just the loss and damage aspect of it. So we have also mitigation, which are your solar panels and offsetting carbon emissions. And we have adaptation, where we look at making ourselves or our cities, everything more resilient, like Stuart does with his water research, making sure that we still have enough drinking water with the growing population, but diminishing aquifers. So, and loss and damage is basically just the tip of the iceberg, and we can't really put a dollar figure on it. It's it can go into the trillions depending on how you look at loss and damage, from a personal point of view, from a compensation point of view, from destroyed infrastructure point of view, or from GDP loss. So I would not be able to put an exact figure on that one.
Thanks, Melanie, and thanks so much to Nora on YouTube who asked that question. So going back to birds for a little while and urban spaces, we've got Eddie who's on YouTube, Jacinta, who wants to know, what are the changes you've seen in species assemblages across Urbania? And this is similar to Alison on YouTube, who also asked, what factors do you use to examine diversity? Is it just the number of species, or do you look at clustering of species?
Yeah, cool. So good questions. So I will, I guess, give a bit of a disclaimer and say that I'm not at the end of my PhD yet. I do still have a bit of analysis ahead of me. So some of my results are still a bit preliminary, but I can still comment on both of those. So in terms of what kinds of compositional changes I have seen, we often find that in more heavily developed areas, there are particular types of birds that are the clear winners. So they're the ones that are always able to, regardless of how many houses we have or how intense the disturbance is. And these birds tend to be larger in terms of their body size. And they also tend to have more of a generalist diet. So things like magpies, currawongs, at least at home for me in Melbourne, these are the kinds of birds that I'm talking about. Also some of the larger honey eater species, so like noisy miners and wattlebirds, they do incredibly well in our urban gardens. And it's the other end of the spectrum, the birds that seem to be losing, unfortunately, the smaller bodied birds that might have more specialist requirements. So whether that's a specialized diet, or they need quite a particular habitat type for nesting or for just shelter requirements. So they might be, they tend to be smaller, and they're going to be more reliant on things like shrubs, and having a bit more shelter so they can hide out from the predatory species. They're the ones that tend to disappear.
Yeah, and
what was the second question that you had for me, Lee? Sorry?
Yeah, sorry, there's a little bit of a lag here. The other part of the question was about net numbers of species versus looking at clusters of species and how you kind of measure diversity.
Yeah, so there's a few different ways that you can measure diversity. So the most simple way to do that is just by using what we call species richness, which is the total number of different species that you have in an area. But you can also look at, like I'm planning to use a measure which is known as beta diversity. So that is looking at the similarity between different sites or between different suburbs. So that will give you an idea as to how homogenized the bird fauna is, so how similar it is in, say, more developed areas versus less developed areas. So there's definitely a couple of different ways that you can measure diversity.
Yeah, great. It's such an interesting question to take apart. Thanks for that. We'll now go to the land of water supply and recycling water. Again, Stuart, we've got a very pertinent question from Anita on YouTube, who wants to know, how does Australia manage water supply chain risk and distribution during the coronavirus pandemic?
That is a pertinent question. That's a very current big issue that the water industry itself is grappling with, and there are lots of discussions going on around the country on that exact topic. So there are clear risks if we were unable to provide the chemicals that are required for water treatment, particularly things like chlorine for disinfection, then we would struggle to continue to provide safe drinking water. My understanding is that the Australian water industry is not expecting to have major disruptions like this, that the such supply chain risks are largely under control. But it really is something that does require a lot of attention and needs to be taken very seriously. One of the things that the Australian water industry has in place, in fact, is a big mutual aid network. And we really saw it come together during the bushfires, where some water utilities might get into trouble. They might be running out of chlorine or other chemicals. And other water utilities will come to their aid, and there is a very strong and cooperative network in place now. And I don't know whether such a thing exists in most other industries or whether it's unique to the water industry, but I see it as very active and very important. It's also important to remember that supply chain risks are not just physical substances, they're not just chemicals, but it's all of the contractors and the human labor are the supply chain now. There's a lot of outsourcing in the Australian water industry. So there's a lot of reliance on third parties to run water treatment plants, to design plants, to provide chemicals, to provide the services that are needed by water treatment plants. So there are many opportunities for things to go wrong, for the supply chain to fall over. And I'm sure this crisis will be a big wake-up call to the industry to provide a big reminder that that's a key question, and managing that supply chain going into the future really needs to be front of mind for an island like Australia, where we really could end up in a situation where we run short of things that we absolutely rely on.
Yeah, definitely. So kind of following on from that, Stuart, I've just got a couple of similar related questions here. Sarah on YouTube asking, does Australia reuse any of the components of wastewater aside from the water? And we've got Jen on Twitter asking more specifically, what's happening with recycled water in Adelaide? Mm-hmm.
Yep. So Australia does use other components of what's in wastewater. Wastewater is a gold mine of valuable substances. Wastewater, first of all, it contains the water, which we need to recover and reuse. It also contains a lot of energy. There have been calculations showing that if you look at all of the chemicals that are present in wastewater, the chemical energy is around about 8 kilojoules per litre, which doesn't sound like a huge amount, but in Sydney, where we discharge 1 million litres per day into the Pacific Ocean, it's about enough energy to power about 140,000 homes per day. Nowhere near the size of Sydney, but it's a good contribution. We do recover energy. We're increasingly recovering energy from wastewater. There are lots of plants around Australia now, the big ones in particular, that will digest the biosolids that are produced as a byproduct of wastewater treatment. And when you digest biosolids, you produce methane. And there are plants. Melbourne Water has a big plant that do cogeneration with the methane. They produce electricity, and they pretty much run the whole plant off the electricity that that they produce from the methane. So recovering energy is important. Another valuable component is the nutrients, and particularly phosphorus. Phosphorus is a non-renewable resource. We use it to grow our food, we eat it, we excrete it, it ends up in the toilet and out into the ocean. It's very important that we start recovering phosphorus. We don't do that in a focused way at the moment. We don't have a phosphorus mining operation from wastewater as we probably should, but a lot of the wastewater is actually used for irrigation. We irrigate farms, we irrigate golf courses and playing fields, and of course the nutrients get reused in that way, and where we need to apply less artificial nutrients or artificial sources of nutrients when we irrigate with wastewater. But they're the only real examples. We recover water, energy, and phosphorus.
Wow, thanks, Stuart. Lots of useful things there in wastewater. Not waste after all. Okay, we're now crossing to Melanie with a couple of questions. Sarah from YouTube, Beatrice from YouTube is asking Melanie, does international funding align with local needs of island nations, I expect, as per their perspective? Is there room for improvement there? And then we've got a follow-up question from the Crossed Hearts on YouTube. How will international funding impact local views on climate change? Would they want to do it in their own way or welcome international help? So, Melanie, what do you have to say about those?
Yeah, that's
questions?
really, really good questions, very much related to what I'm doing. So one of the things I actually want to find out is whether what we discuss on an international level is aligned with what people would need on the ground. So it's not just about what we discuss in climate change negotiations, but what do the policymakers in the government, in the national governments need in order to implement something for the people that are directly affected by these hurricanes, natural disasters, sea level rise, droughts, and what I've talked about. And so one way I try to find out about that was actually talking to a lot of stakeholders internationally during those negotiations and people making those policies. So also NGOs, what are their thoughts on that? They work in those countries. They are on the ground. They talk to people. And and that's one thing I try to find out. And I don't have all the answers yet. So like Jacinta, I'm also not at the end of my PhD yet. But I can say that there is sometimes we have misconceptions on what we believe is needed for the people that are affected and what we discuss on a very much higher level. So and that is also comes through the interviews that I did in Dominica and the Caribbean. Talking to people really gives you an insight of where we should funnel and our funding and what is needed. So that just gives us a really good indication of where we need to put them to invest our money in to help people in small island states or in other developing countries. So there is I wouldn't say there is a discrepancy as such, but I think sometimes we need to confirm, reaffirm, or maybe even negate what we're currently doing. So it's not a black and white answer. Yeah, and the second, the second one, would you mind repeating that, please?
Yeah, so the question is how international funding impacts local views on climate change, and would they want to do it their own way or welcome international help?
Yeah, very, very interesting question as well. So one of the things that I found out is the people on islands are incredibly resilient. Speaking to them, sometimes it really inspires me of, just how they deal with these problems that we can't even imagine having. So I think it is really important that we include them in decision-making processes and let them tell us what is important on the ground, in their homes, in their villages, in their communities. So, and yes, there is international help welcomed, and I do believe that we have a responsibility as rich developed countries to help island nations and also other developing countries. It's just that my PhD is on island nations. That's why I'm referring to the islands. But we have a responsibility to help. And yes, international funding might be welcomed, but we have to keep in mind that ultimately we need to let the people tell us what is needed and where the funding should be going. So there is some collaboration that needs to happen here.
Yeah, great. And that's a perfect segue. You've actually covered a lot of what Alison on Facebook was already wondering about. She says some projects are perceived to be more attractive than others. How do communities work and advocate for what's best for them and not just considered good by outsiders? Have you seen different methods of communities advocating for themselves, or is it mostly through the sort of things you're doing?
In the Pacific, people are very much aware of climate change and very much aware of what's currently happening to their islands. So you might have seen one of the pictures that I took from the internet. It's a very famous picture of islanders saying that we are not drowning, we are fighting. So they are making or trying to draw attention to themselves. So there are different ways of doing that, and this is happening in the Pacific, but also in the Caribbean, where people find different avenues of making other people aware what is happening in their homes. There are organizations.
Absolutely.
Sorry.
Oh yeah, I was just saying absolutely. I was remembering UN talks are quite often a stage where Pacific Islands, island nations advocate for themselves. Yeah,
very, very, very vocal and strongly advocating for climate change action because it's needed. I'm biased. It's needed.
Biased by evidence seems like a good reason. Thanks, Melanie. Well, now we've got a question from Grant on YouTube for Stuart. Grant is asking, should we be looking to small-scale recycling as part of building codes like we do with solar? And at the same time, for Stuart from Claire on Facebook, the examples you've given are for large cities. What work is being done on smaller scale systems? Is there a volume threshold on the viability of systems to recycle drinking water quality?
They're all excellent questions, and I'll quickly answer one that you asked me earlier that I didn't, I overlooked, about Adelaide and what water recycling is going on in Adelaide, yes. Because Adelaide's very important. Adelaide has actually the biggest water recycling scheme in Australia, which is water that comes from the Bolivar sewage treatment plant. Adelaide's biggest sewage treatment plant is treated and is used not for drinking. Not for drinking, but a large amount of it is actually pumped up into the through a pipeline called the Virginia Pipeline into an area that's used for irrigation for market garden vegetables. And in fact, a lot of grapes, a lot of cucumbers and lettuces and tomatoes are all grown with recycled water and recycling those nutrients as they do so in Adelaide. In terms of the question about should we be looking at more decentralized options, that's a really good question because we're doing both at the same time. There are a number of decentralized water recycling schemes going into cities around Australia, and I can think of examples in practically every city where we might have like a 6-star commercial building or a residential building where recycled water is available and it's used to flush toilets and to water gardens and to mainly outdoor irrigation and toilets, in some cases washing machines as well. I think that the key thing there though is we need to make the distinction. The first thing to think about is what will the water be used for? Will it be used for drinking or for other things other than drinking, such as flushing toilets? Once we decide that we're not using it for drinking, then we're making a decision that we need two very separate systems and we need to duplicate a lot of the plumbing that's required. And these are things that are very difficult to retrofit in existing buildings, in existing suburbs. We only ever see them in new development areas. So there are opportunities to do this decentralized water recycling, but it's going to be a very, very slow process as we get new infill and new development in existing suburbs and parts of our cities. In terms of what can we do in some of the smaller regional towns and cities, there is water recycling being planned in many small regional towns and cities. There's barely a town left in Australia that doesn't irrigate the local golf course, for example, and the local playing fields with recycled water. And that got a lot of towns through the last drought and through the millennium drought before it. I don't believe there's a minimum scale at which recycling is viable. The treatment processes themselves are very modular. So you can start off small and you can build up and build to scale. There is a scale, I think, in terms of having the skills. You know, a lot of the small local governments, local councils, the way that the water industry is set up in places like New South Wales and Queensland, for example, where it's very local government focused, don't necessarily have the skills to be able to fully implement all of the requirements in terms of risk management, the getting through the regulatory hoops, etc. So there's a scale issue there, but in terms of the technology, no, I don't believe so. The space station does recycling for what, a dozen people or something that might be on the space station, on the International Space Station at any particular moment, but they're recycling water, reusing their own effluent and reusing it as drinking water. So it can be done at a small scale, but some of the bigger risk management and social issues require a certain degree of size, I think.
Thanks, Stuart. And just super briefly before I give you all one final question before wrap up, on Grant's point, making it part of the building codes, is anything happening around that like it is with solar?
In a sense, and the sense is, yes, there is a rating agency. There is a system in Australia for rating of buildings as 6-star buildings, for example, where you get certain points for water efficiency. It doesn't have to be water recycling. There are many ways to meet water efficiency targets, but given particular levels of efficiency, recycling is one of the options that can be used. So there are building codes. There's a system called Watermark that's in place that refers to things like rainwater tanks. In New South Wales, we have a system called Basics that the New South Wales government set up to mandate water efficiency in new developments. And so in some cases, that leads to water recycling or water reuse as one of the options, but it doesn't have to be the option of choice. So yes, we're seeing it more and more embedded in the codes for how we build our cities.
Great. Well, now we are getting close to the end of the session. So I just wanted to ask firstly, Jacinta, as it relates to your field, what's one vital thing we can do to build a resilient environment?
Oh, it's such a big question. For my field, I think that the best thing that we can be doing is just maintaining any habitat that we have available. Even if it's a tiny little patch and you don't think it's that great, it might still be suitable for some wildlife that live in the area. So just maintaining whatever habitat you have available in private land and also in our council parklands as well.
Great, thank you. And Melanie, same question. What can we do to help build a resilient environment as it relates to your field?
I was scared of the question, to be honest. Yeah, it's a very big question, and if we look at financing it, I'm not sure whether one person or each of us can really do something about it, because we wouldn't be able to provide the finances that are required. So maybe it's about being aware of it and being aware of what's happening to islands around us, to the Pacific, to the Caribbean, but also other developing countries who do not have the capacity to bounce back from disasters or from severe droughts or bushfires as much as we do. So we have the capacity. We can absorb shocks easier, but we won't be able to do that that much longer either. So being aware of that and being aware of that they are people that we have responsibility for because of the current situation we are in. Maybe that is one thing to start.
Yeah, thanks, Melanie. And Stuart, you've had a little bit of time to think about this question.
And in fact, I think we're doing it right here, right now, the most important thing, which is talking about it. Things like recycling wastewater can be confronting, particularly when we start talking about using it to supplement our drinking water supplies. And people have genuine questions that genuinely need to be answered. We talked about how well do the treatment processes to remove hormones and antibiotics. These are the things that concern people, and I think quite legitimately so. So I think communicating what we know about the science, the engineering, the ability of technology to achieve the outcomes we want is important to build community acceptance. And once you have community acceptance, you start to have political acceptance, and that's where change starts to happen. So congratulations to you for already taking the important step for us by setting up such a forum.
Thanks so much. Thanks, Stuart, and thanks to all of you, Jacinta, Melanie, and Stuart. I've just, before we wrap up, and I have to say there are more questions from everyone, so I hope the speakers will have time maybe to have a look at Twitter and YouTube and have a look at some of those other questions. But I just wanted to let everyone know that there are other Pint AU online events happening through live stream. There's another panel tonight, in fact, in 30 minutes. So that will be 8:30 p.m. Australian Eastern Standard Time. The theme for that one is Our Body, Identity is Everything, and it's hosted by Dr. Brad McKay with speakers on immunology and urinary fingerprinting, which I am intrigued to hear about. Tomorrow night at 7:30 p.m. Australian Eastern Standard Time, there's online trivia and there will be prizes to be won, so get along to that. There will also be 2 more panels on Wednesday. So there's What's the Matter, featuring speakers on astrophysics, quantum physics and nuclear fusion, and that will be hosted by Kirsten Banks. There's also Brain Health in Our Modern World, featuring speakers on stroke, dementia, and how the built environment affects our mood. So that will be hosted by Broderick Matthews. I also encourage you to have a look on Twitter and Instagram at the hashtag #ThisIsMyScience. A lot of the speakers, the scientists involved, and others have been using that hashtag to introduce themselves. So if you're looking for more people to follow on Twitter and Instagram, hashtag #ThisIsMyScience. You will also be able to ask Jacinta more questions if you had any that didn't get answered tonight. She is doing a Reddit AMA, or Ask Me Anything, for those who aren't on Reddit very often. So you'll be able to ask her anything on Wednesday the 13th, so keep an eye out for that one. There's also a podcast, Pod of Science, with short interviews with scientists working in Australia. So now I'd like to just start firstly by thanking our 3 speakers, Melanie, Stuart and Jacinta. Thank you so much. You've all been wonderful.
You're welcome. It was a pleasure.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And I know everyone's really enjoyed asking you questions. Thank you. And thanks to more than 250 volunteers and more than 450 speakers who signed up for the original pub events that did have to be cancelled because of the pandemic. So hopefully they'll be able to do that next year. Thanks to the small team of about 20 people who've done a huge amount of work in the last month to put these new online events together, including the artist in residence, Keith, and the graphic designer, Nicole. You would have all seen those socially distanced Australian native animals in spacesuits. Wonderful. So they've put together the amazing artwork. Thanks also to Grant Carruthers for the music tracks. And once again, thanks to the speakers, but also thank you to the audience joining us on YouTube, on Facebook, and on Twitter and elsewhere from all around Australia, and indeed some overseas. And what's that? More than 3? Sorry, Producers in the air, more than 300 people watching. Thank you so much for coming along to this virtual event and joining us. And Pint events in any format are all about conversation. So thank you very much for having conversations with us tonight. Have a lovely evening and come along for more Science AU events, Pint AU events.
When it rains in the pause on the video store, keeps the lovers indoors. Lovers indoors, didn't budget for the exact contours of the musical score. The musical score opens gaping source for another encore of some unfinished wars. Unfinished wars send her out the front door into the downpours raining by the seashore. Into the downpours raining by the seashore.